Imagine a cold, misty morning in the 1830s. You're a woman standing in a market square in Yorkshire. The cobblestones are slick with frost, and the air is so cold you can see your breath. But the chill you feel isn't just from the weather. It's a deep dread mixed with a strange, desperate hope. Around your neck, a rough piece of rope scrapes your skin. It's a halter, like one you'd see on livestock. Your husband holds the other end, his voice slurred from the ale he drank early that morning. "What am I bid for this fine woman?" he calls out, his tone a practiced mixture of desperation and performance. He lists your qualities as if you were a prized cow. A strong back, good teeth, a knack for cooking and mending. A crowd gathers, their expressions a mix of curiosity, disgust, and cold calculation. Men step forward, examining you just as they would a horse at an auction. They check your hands for calluses to see how hard you work, and they study your face to see if you're pleasant enough to share a bed with. Your heart pounds in your chest, knowing that in the next few minutes, your entire life could change. You might end up with a kinder man, or find yourself in an even worse situation. The most turn-fing part is that none of this is illegal. In the bizarre, twisted logic of the time, this public display is your best, and perhaps only, shot at freedom, a form of divorce for the working class. This practice, known as wife-selling, wasn't born out of pure malice, although cruelty was often a factor. It was a direct result of a legal system that was so rigid and unforgiving that it left impoverished people with no other options. To understand why hundreds of men in Victorian England led their wives to market squares with halters around their necks, you have to understand that in the eyes of the law, women weren't people, they were property. The legal principle of coverture dictated that when a woman got married, her entire identity was erased, absorbed into her husband's. As a legal scholar once put it, a woman's legal existence was suspended during marriage. She became a femme covert, or a covered woman, as if she were hidden beneath her husband's legal cloak. Consider a woman like Mary Thompson in the 1820s. Before she married, she could own property, sign contracts, and even sue someone in court. The moment she said her vows, however, everything changed. Her wages now belonged to her husband. Any inheritance from her parents became his. If she started a small business, like selling bread, every single penny she earned was legally his. Even her clothes were considered his property. If Mary's husband, William, decided to beat her until she couldn't stand, the law offered her little to no protection. A man had the right to correct his wife, just as he might a child or a dog. If he gambled away their rent money or drank their food budget, she had no legal recourse. The law saw this as his right as the head of the household. So what happened when Mary couldn't take it anymore? When William's abuse left her with broken ribs, or his drinking left their children starving? What if she met someone else, a kind widower who treated her with respect, or a single man who offered her genuine affection? For the wealthy, there was divorce, but it was so expensive and complicated, it was only an option for the elite. Before 1857, getting a divorce required a private act of Parliament, a process that cost the equivalent of a staggering amount of money today, more than most working-class families would earn in a lifetime. Even after 1857, when divorce became slightly more accessible through the courts, it still cost more than a laborer's yearly wages. For the poor, there were only a handful of ways out of a marriage. You could separate by mutual agreement, but neither of you could ever legally remarry. You could simply run away and hope your spouse never found you. You could try to get a legal separation through the church, but that was also expensive and didn't allow remarriage. You could die, which, given the harsh living conditions of the time, wasn't uncommon. Or you could sell your wife. This practice started in the late 17th century, likely out of sheer desperation. Since the law treated women as property, some people reasoned, why couldn't that property be transferred to another person, just like any other possession? The ritual that grew out of this idea was both humiliating and bizarrely formal, a grotesque public parody of both divorce and remarriage. The sale often started with a newspaper ad that read like a livestock auction. They would say things like, "John Smith will sell his wife Mary at Doncaster Market next Tuesday. She is healthy, strong, and of good character. No reasonable offer refused." Other ads were more personal, like, Thomas Brown, being tired of his wife, will dispose of her to anyone willing to take her off his hands. She can wash, cook, and milk cows. On the appointed day, the husband would lead his wife to a public space, usually a market square where animals were sold, though sometimes a tavern was used. The symbolism was painfully clear. The wife wore a halter around her neck, arm, or waist, sometimes just a rope, but occasionally a ribbon in a sad attempt at dignity. This halter was proof that she was property. The auctioneer, often the husband himself, would call for bids. He'd list her age, her ability to have children, her skills, and her health. The crowd would press in, with men examining her like buyers at a horse fair. They check her hands for calluses and study her face to judge her attractiveness. But here's what the historical records show that complicates our modern view of these events. In most cases, the sale was prearranged. The buyer was often the woman's lover, and the sale was actually a form of consensual divorce and remarriage, all rolled into one public ceremony. The humiliation was real, but it served a purpose. It made the separation publicly witnessed and, in the minds of the people involved, legally binding. There's a documented case from Brighton in 1826 that inspired Thomas Hardy's novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge. A man led his wife to market and sold her to a sailor for a few pounds. The newspaper reported that she seemed nothing loath to go, and the entire transaction was conducted with every appearance of good humor. The sailor had likely been courting her for months, and all three parties saw the sale as their only way to end one relationship and begin another. In another account from 1830, a wife who was sold for a few shillings was determined to go through with the transaction, despite her husband's last-minute hesitation. She looked him in the face and declared, "Let be, you rogue. I will be sold. I want a change." Her voice, full of defiance, echoes across the centuries. She was seizing the small amount of agency the law allowed her. The prices paid for wives varied wildly, from the equivalent of many thousands of dollars to as little as a glass of ale. But the money wasn't really the point. What mattered was the public nature of the transaction, witnessed by dozens or even hundreds of people who could later testify that the woman had been legally transferred from one man to another. The halter itself held deep symbolic meaning. After the sale, it was handed to the new husband as proof that the deal was done. This wasn't just a performance. It was a desperate attempt to create a sense of legality where none existed. Sometimes the entual became more elaborate. Bills of sale were drawn up and signed with language that mimicked real property transfers. The document would declare that the husband, for and in consideration of the sum of a certain amount, would sell, assign, and set over unto the new man his wife, with all right, property, claim, services, and demands whatsoever. The ceremony would often end with all parties going to the nearest pub for a wedding feast, paid for by the new husband. In one case from 1827, church bells even rang. The community, starved for entertainment, treated these events like a combination of a theatrical performance, a court proceeding, and a carnival. Crowds of hundreds would gather to watch. But not every wife's sale was a prearranged, consensual agreement between lovers. Some were genuine auctions, where women were bid upon by strangers. In March of 1766, a carpenter from Southwark sold his wife on a whim while at a pub. When he sobered up and asked her to come back, she refused, and he hanged himself. The desperation behind both the sale and its aftermath shows the impossible situations these laws created. In 1824 in Manchester, a wife was sold for a small amount of money, but she didn't like the man who bought her. She was put up for auction again for an even lower price. A woman's voice did matter. She could refuse buyers she found unsuitable. But imagine the terror of standing there while strangers bid on you like livestock, knowing your future depended on which of these men was willing to pay the most. The practice was especially common in Yorkshire. In May of 1837, a blacksmith in Halifax sold his wife for a shilling, then bought her back, and then sold her again to a different man. When the wife found out, she was furious and mauled her faithless spouse rather severely, a detail that suggests she had not agreed to any of these transactions. Even children were not exempt. Wives were sometimes sold with their children included in the price, like accessories to the main purchase. In 1865, a woman and her 2 children were sold for a large sum, a price that represented several years of wages for a working man. The buyer was taking on not just a wife but an entire family with all the financial responsibilities that came with them. The authorities' response to wife selling was inconsistent and often confused. Legally, the practice had no basis in law. It was essentially a conspiracy to commit adultery, followed by bigamy. But many local officials seemed uncertain about their power to intervene. In 1819, a magistrate who tried to stop a sale was pelted with objects and driven away by the crowd. He later admitted that he didn't think he had the right to prevent it, because it was based on a deeply held custom of the people. Some local officials even encouraged the practice. In 1814, a workhouse authority forced a man to sell his wife rather than have the parish support his separated family. The symbolism of the marketplace location was intentional. Markets were where livestock and property changed hands, where the community gathered to witness transactions. By choosing these locations, people were inserting their private drama into the most public commercial space available, demanding that their community validate what the law refused to recognize. The halter around the woman's neck made explicit what the law only implied, that wives were property, no different from animals. The practice began to decline in the 1840s as social attitudes shifted and divorce became slightly more accessible. Newspaper coverage became more critical, calling the sales disgusting and disgraceful. The rising middle class, increasingly uncomfortable with these public displays, pushed for prosecutions. By the 1850s, more sales were conducted privately to avoid public shame. Religious and social reform movements also worked to suppress the custom. The last recorded wife sale in England took place in 1913, when a woman claimed in court that her husband had sold her to a workmate. The true horror of wife selling wasn't just the ritual itself. It was what the ritual revealed about the society that made it necessary. These weren't savage customs practiced by barbarians. They were the logical response of desperate people trapped in an irrational legal system. When the law offered no way out of an intolerable marriage, people created their own remedies, no matter how grotesque. The women who stood in those market squares with halters around their necks weren't just victims of their husband's cruelty. They were victims of a legal system that refused to see them as human beings. They were caught between the legal fiction that they didn't exist and the practical reality that they had to find a way to survive, escape abuse, and seek happiness. For some, that escape came through the degrading theater of a wife sale. They endured the humiliation of being auctioned like livestock because it offered something the law denied them, a second chance. For a few shillings and the price of their dignity, they could legally become someone else's property, and perhaps, if they were lucky, that someone else would treat them like a human being rather than possession. The crowds that gathered to watch these sales weren't just looking for entertainment. They were witnesses to their community's attempt to solve problems that the law couldn't or wouldn't address. They were participating in a form of rough justice, a way of making public what the private law kept hidden. Even in communities where wife-selling persisted, it was controversial. One witness to a sale in 1860 said the buyer felt the act was proper and lawful, but the villagers disagreed, burning effigies of the couple on the village green. The practice even crossed class lines. The Duke of Chandos reportedly bought his second wife from an innkeeper who was beating her, paying a small sum for her. He had her educated, and they were by all accounts happy together. These stories complicate our understanding of what wife-selling meant to the people who practiced it. Yes, it was degrading and treated women as property in the most literal way, but in its twisted way, it was also a form of liberation. The historical record suggests that many wives actively participated in arranging their own sales. In one case, a woman provided the money for an agent to buy her out of her marriage. In many instances, wives insisted on the sale when their husbands had second thoughts. They weren't just passive victims being traded against their will. They were active participants in the only form of divorce available to them. This reality doesn't make the practice any less horrifying, but it helps us understand why it lasted for over 2 centuries. Wife-selling wasn't just about men getting rid of unwanted wives. It was about desperate families trying to solve impossible problems with the only tools they had. The context of the time makes it even more tragic. This was an era when a working man might earn 10 shillings a week, when families lived in single rooms without running water, and when children as young as 6 worked 12-hour days in factories. Life was brutal, short, and offered few choices. For the wealthy, marriage might be about companionship and social advancement, but for the poor, it was often just another economic arrangement. When that arrangement fell apart, when a husband drank away the household money, when a wife couldn't have children, when violence made home unbearable, the poor had nowhere to go. The church offered moral guidance but no practical help. The law offered punishment but no relief. Only the rough justice of a community-sanctioned wife sale offered a way out. The newspaper accounts of these sales, written mostly by and for the middle class, often dripped with condescension and moral outrage. They described the people involved as brutish and degraded, and the crowds as savage and voyeuristic. But if you read between the lines, you can find stories of desperate people making impossible choices with as much dignity as they could. From our modern perspective, it's easy to focus on the cruelty and degradation. The image of a woman with a rope around her neck, being auctioned like livestock, seems like the ultimate symbol of female oppression. And it was, but it was also something else. It was a community trying to create justice where the law offered none. It was a way for desperate people to claim some control in a system that was designed to deny them choices. It was a rough, imperfect, and often cruel solution, but it was also the only form of divorce available to the poor. The practice died out not because society suddenly became more enlightened about women's rights, but because legal divorce became slightly more accessible and because changing economic conditions gave women other options. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 slowly began to chip away at the legal concept of coverture, allowing wives to keep their earrings and inherit property. The law was, very slowly, starting to recognize that women were people, not property. But for the women who stood in those market squares in the early 19th century, with halters around their necks and crowds pressing in to examine them, those changes came too late. They lived in a world that offered them no legal identity, no right to their own money, and no escape from violent or miserable marriages, except through the humiliating public spectacle of a sale. Their stories remind us that progress isn't guaranteed, and that the legal rights we take for granted today were hard-won at an enormous cost. They remind us that the rights you enjoy were built on the suffering of women who had no choice but to wear halters around their necks and hope that someone, anyone, would treat them more kindly than the law did. The last echoes of those market auctions died out over a century ago, but they leave us with uncomfortable questions about the systems we've built and the people those systems fail. They remind us that behind every strange historical practice are human stories of survival, desperation, and the endless search for a better life, even when that life comes at an almost unbearable price. The horror of wife selling becomes even more real when you look at the specific details of how these auctions played out. Imagine you're an observer in that market square. The morning mist hasn't yet lifted from the cobblestones, and the air smells like hay, manure, and the metallic tang of fear you'd expect from a livestock market. But the fear today is coming from a different source. The person on the makeshift platform isn't a cow or a sheep. She's someone's daughter, a mother, a sister. Her name could have been Elizabeth, Sarah, or Mary, names now lost to history, except for a few faded newspaper clippings. She's about 28 years old, let's say, with hands that are rough from work, and a face that might have been pretty before poverty and hard living carved lines around her eyes. The halter around her neck isn't for show. It's a thick rope, the kind used to lead horses, and it chafes against her skin with every small movement. Her husband, soon to be her ex-husband, holds the other end with the casual grip of a man who has done this before, though his hand shakes a little from the ale he drank to steady his nerves. "Come now, gentlemen," he calls out, his voice carrying across the square. "What will you give for this fine piece of woman flesh? She's strong as an ox, can work 16 hours without complaint, and she's got all her teeth. He forces her mouth open with his calloused fingers, showing her teeth to the crowd like a horse trader showing off his merchandise. The men in the crowd press closer, their breath visible in the cold air, their eyes calculating. They aren't monsters. They're farmers, laborers, and tradesmen who understand value and practicality. They examine her hands for calluses that prove she can work. They look at her hips to see if she can bear children. They study her face to determine if she's attractive enough to warm their beds on a cold night. A blacksmith steps forward and pinches her arm to test the firmness of her flesh. She's a bit thin, he says clinically. Might not last through a hard winter. What's her temperament like? Is she given to fits or melancholy? Sweet as a lamb when she's treated right, the husband replies quickly. Never raises her voice, does exactly as she's told. Good with children, too. Raised 3 of her own without losing a single one to fever. But you can see something in the woman's eyes that contradicts this description. There's a hardness there, a calculating intelligence that suggests she's anything but a docile creature. Her lips are pressed together in a thin line, and her hands are clenched so tightly her knuckles are white. She's not a passive victim. She's a participant, playing a role in a drama that might be her only path to freedom. The bidding begins tentatively. 2 shillings, calls out a cattle dealer, more to test the waters than from a serious interest. The amount draws sneers from the crowd. It's barely enough to buy a decent meal. 2 and 6, a young farmer says, his face flushed with excitement or embarrassment. He's maybe 25, with the awkwardness of someone who's never been married and sees this as a way to get a ready-made household. The woman's eyes dart to him, sizing him up quickly. Is he cruel? Does he drink? Will he beat her on a Saturday night when the ale makes him mean? In these few seconds, she's making calculations that will decide the rest of her life. 3 shillings. A voice comes from the back of the crowd. It's a man she recognizes, Thomas Miller, a widower who has been visiting her in secret for months. Relief floods her face so quickly that several observers notice and nudge each other. This isn't a random auction. It's a performance designed to give a legal-like legitimacy to an arrangement that has already been made. But the young farmer doesn't understand the choreography. 4 shillings, he calls out eagerly, genuinely believing he's competing for a wife. And I'll throw in a pig. Now the woman looks truly frightened. This isn't part of the plan. Thomas Miller frowns and steps forward. 5 shillings, he says firmly, his voice holding a warning that the younger man seems to miss entirely. 6! The farmer responds immediately, caught up in the competitive spint. The crowd murmurs, appreciating the entertainment. This is better than they expected. The woman tries to catch her husband's eye to signal that something has gone wrong, but he's already counting the money in his head, calculating how much ale 6 shillings will buy. For the first time, real terror crosses her face. She could end up with a stranger, someone who might be even crueler than the husband she's trying to escape. 7 shillings, Thomas Miller says through gritted teeth. It's more money than he has, but he can see the woman's distress. The young farmer hesitates, patting his pockets. 7 shillings plus a pig is a big investment. He looks at the woman again, really studying her face, and something in her expression finally gets through to him. She's not looking at him with gratitude or even resigned acceptance. She's looking at him with the kind of fear reserved for a rabid dog. 7 shillings and 6 pence, he says, but his voice lacks conviction. The husband, sensing the shift in the mood, is drunk enough to be greedy, but not so drunk that he misses the dangerous tension. Wife selling depends on community acceptance, and crowds can turn ugly when they sense something isn't right. Going once for 7 and 6, he calls out quickly, hoping to end the auction before it gets out of control. 8 shillings, Thomas Miller says desperately, even though everyone can see he doesn't have that kind of money. The moment stretches out. The woman stands frozen between her current misery and an unknown future, while 2 men bid for the right to own her as completely as they might own a horse or a table. Then something unexpected happens. The woman speaks. I choose Thomas Miller, she says clearly, her voice carrying across the now quiet square. I'll go with him willingly, but I won't be sold to a stranger like a sack of grain. The crowd erupts in murmurs. This isn't how wife selling is supposed to work. The woman doesn't get to choose. That's the whole point of the auction. But there's something in her voice, a dignity that commands respect, and several men in the crowd nod in agreement. "The lass has spoken," an old man calls out. "Let her go to who she wants. This isn't a cattle market." "But I bid highest," the young farmer protests, though he sounds more relieved than disappointed. The husband looks around nervously. He's lost control of his own auction, and the crowd's mood is shifting. Wife selling works because the community accepts it as legitimate, but legitimacy depends on following certain unspoken rules. One of those rules, apparently, is that the woman's preferences matter. 7 shillings from Thomas Miller, he announces quickly, cutting his losses. And she goes willingly, so there's no arguing with the bargain. Thomas Miller steps forward with money he's borrowed from 3 different neighbors, his face flushed with relief and embarrassment. The halter is formally transferred to him, but he immediately takes it off the woman's neck and throws it aside. The crowd applauds, as if they've just seen a play with a satisfying conclusion. The woman, let's call her Sarah, curtsies to the crowd with more dignity than anyone present deserves, then takes Thomas Miller's arm. But as the crowd disperses, you can see the true cost of this happy ending. Sarah may have escaped one bad situation, but she's now legally bound to Thomas Miller, just as she was to her first husband. If Thomas turns out to be cruel or a drunkard, she'll have no more recourse than she had before. She has simply traded one form of legal slavery for another, hoping her new master will be kinder than her old one. The young farmer who almost bought her watches them go, his feelings a mess of disappointment and unease. He had been lonely enough to think purchasing a wife was a reasonable solution, but he's now disturbed by what he just witnessed. He had never really thought about what it would mean to own another human being. Sarah's former husband pockets his 7 shillings and heads for the nearest tavern. He feels a mixture of relief and loss that he doesn't quite understand. Sarah had been a burden, certainly, but she had also been the only person in the world who cared whether he lived or died, even if that care was mixed with fear and resentment. This specific scene is fictional, but it's based on dozens of real documented cases that follow remarkably similar patterns. The reality of wife selling was both more complex and more heartbreaking than the simple story of men getting rid of unwanted wives. It was about people trying to find a way out of a system that offered them none. The practice died out, not because it was outlawed, but because a series of legal and social changes gave women and men more choices, making the brutal spectacle of a wife sale seem less necessary and more abhorrent. Consider the case of Mary Ann Price, sold in Merthyr Tydfil in 1837. A newspaper described her as a young woman of prepossessing appearance who was led into the market with a new rope around her waist. She was sold to a man named Lewis for 4 shillings and 6 pence, but the transaction was clearly prearranged. Lewis was described as her sweetheart, and the sale was conducted with the apparent satisfaction of all parties. Buried in the account, however, are details that hint at a deeper story. Mary Ann's husband was a collier, a coal miner, much addicted to drink. The sale took place during a severe economic depression in the Welsh mining districts, where families were struggling to survive on reduced wages. Mary Ann's choice to be sold was likely a choice between starvation with a drunken husband and survival with a man who could provide for her. Or consider a more unsettling case from Carlisle in 1832. Where a woman put up for sale by her husband refused to accept any of the bidders. The crowd grew hostile when she continued to reject potential buyers, and the situation became so tense that a local magistrate had to intervene to prevent violence. The woman was ultimately knocked down to a man she had never met for 3 shillings, but she refused to go with him. The sale was declared invalid, and she was allowed to return to her husband, though what happened to her afterward isn't recorded. These cases reveal the fundamental contradiction at the heart of wife selling. The practice depended on the legal fiction that women were property that could be transferred at will, but it also depended on the woman's consent for community acceptance. A wife who was clearly being sold against her will sometimes generated sympathy and intervention from crowds who might otherwise enjoy the spectacle. The geographical distribution of wife selling also tells us something important about the social and economic conditions that made it seem necessary. Yorkshire, with its industrial towns and rural poverty, had the highest number of documented cases. The practice was less common in the prosperous south and almost unknown in Scotland, where different legal traditions provided other options for unhappy couples. In the industrial north, where traditional social structures were breaking down under the pressure of rapid economic change, wife selling offered a way to adapt old customs to new circumstances. When marriages failed under these pressures, traditional remedies like family pressure or community intervention were less available. The symbolism of the halter, which so deeply connected wife selling to the livestock trade, also served a practical, legal-like purpose. English common law recognized several ways of transferring property, and the physical handling of goods, called livery of seisin, was one of the most ancient and respected methods. By using a halter and conducting the sale in a marketplace, participants were invoking legal traditions that went back to medieval times. The halter also served a psychological purpose for both sellers and buyers. For husbands, it made explicit what the law already implied, that their wives were property. For buyers, it symbolized their new rights and responsibilities. For the women themselves, the moment when the halter was removed often marked their psychological transition from one household to another. Some of the most elaborate wife sales involved a woman being transferred multiple times. In Sheffield in 1842, a woman was sold 3 times in one day as different men bid for her and then changed their minds. Each time, she had to endure the humiliation of being examined by potential buyers, only to find herself back on the auction block when the transaction fell through. The newspaper account describes her becoming increasingly distraught, finally breaking down in tears when the 3rd sale was also canceled. These multiple sales reveal the fundamental instability of the entire system. Because wife selling had no basis in law, there was no way to enforce the contracts or resolve disputes. A buyer who changed his mind could simply return his purchase and demand his money back. A woman who found her new situation intolerable had no recourse except to convince her new husband to sell her again. The children of sold wives occupied a particularly tragic position in these arrangements. Sometimes they were included in the sale price, like accessories to the main purchase. A woman sold in Pontefract in 1847 came with 3 children, and the buyer agreed to take responsibility for their upbringing and education. More often, children were left behind with their fathers, separated from their mothers by a transaction they were too young to understand. The emotional impact on these children doesn't appear in most historical records, but we can imagine the trauma of watching your mother led away with a rope around her neck by a stranger who had just purchased her. The practice of wife selling also had profound effects on the communities where it occurred. These sales were public events that drew crowds of hundreds, sometimes thousands of spectators. They became forms of popular entertainment, but they also served as community discussions about marriage, morality, and the limits of acceptable behavior. The crowds that gathered for wife sales weren't passive observers. They were active participants in a form of rough justice. They could approve or disapprove of particular sales, intervene when they felt a woman was being treated unfairly, and use their collective voice to enforce community standards. These community interventions reveal that wife selling wasn't simply a matter of individual desperation. It was embedded in complex social networks. The practice could only function when it had community support, and that support was conditional on following certain unspoken rules about fairness and consent. The declining social status of wife selling in the mid-19th century reflected broader changes in British society. The growing middle class, with its emphasis on domestic privacy and moral respectability, was increasingly uncomfortable with public displays of working-class marital breakdown. Newspapers began describing wife sales as disgusting exhibitions and brutal spectacles, language that reflected the class anxieties of an era when industrial capitalism was creating sharp distinctions between respectable and disreputable behavior. Religious revival movements also played a role in suppressing the practice. Evangelical Christianity, with its emphasis on the sanctity of marriage, viewed wife-selling as a sign of spiritual corruption that needed to be eliminated. The legal system's response to wife-selling evolved slowly. Before 1850, prosecutions were rare and penalties light. But as social attitudes hardened, courts began imposing harsher sentences. By the 1860s, men convicted of selling their wives could face 6 months in prison, and buyers could be charged with conspiracy to commit adultery. However, proving that a wife sale had actually occurred was often difficult. The participants had strong incentives to deny that any money had changed hands, or to claim that the ceremony was just a joke. Juries, often drawn from working-class communities where wife-selling was still understood if not approved, were sometimes reluctant to convict people for what they saw as attempts to solve impossible problems. The emergence of music hall entertainment in the mid-19th century gave wife-selling a new cultural life, even as the practice itself declined. Popular songs like "The Sale of a Wife" turned the ritual into comedy, portraying the husband as a fool, the wife as a shrew, and the buyer as a dupe. These songs sanitized the real desperation and humiliation of wife-selling by transforming it into harmless entertainment for middle-class audiences. But the persistence of wife-selling in popular culture reveals something important about its psychological and social functions. The practice addressed deep anxieties about marriage, property, and gender relations that didn't disappear when the ritual itself became socially unacceptable. The international dimension of wife-selling also deserves attention. English settlers brought the practice to American colonies, where it persisted into the 19th century. Colonial court records document cases from Connecticut to South Carolina, suggesting that the custom was adaptable to different social and economic conditions. The French, meanwhile, were particularly fascinated by English wife-selling, seeing it as evidence of British barbarism and moral corruption. French newspapers regularly reported on English sales, often exaggerating the details for dramatic effect. This international attention was deeply embarrassing to English elites, who were trying to position Britain as the leader of European civilization and moral progress. The role of alcohol in wife-selling cannot be overlooked. Many sales began in taverns, fueled by drink and a male camaraderie that made the degradation of women seem acceptable or even amusing. The ritual often ended with all parties drinking together to celebrate the transaction, a practice that helped to normalize what might otherwise seem shocking. But alcohol also provided a convenient excuse for men who later regretted their actions. Several documented cases involve husbands who sold their wives while drunk and then tried to reclaim them when sober. The economic dimensions of wife-selling become clearer when we examine it alongside other forms of working-class survival strategy. In communities where unemployment was common and wages were barely sufficient for survival, marriage was often an economic necessity rather than a romantic choice. When these economic partnerships failed, wife-selling provided a way to rearrange resources. The prices paid for wives reflected these economic calculations. Women described as good workers or skilled at trades like spinning commanded higher prices. The haggling that surrounded these sales reveals that participants understood exactly what they were buying, not just a woman, but her labor, her fertility, and her domestic skills. The documents that survive from wife sales often contain revealing details about working-class life. Newspaper accounts describe women's clothing, their physical appearance, and their temperaments. They record the words spoken during sales, preserving fragments of working-class speech that rarely appear in other historical sources. These documents also reveal the elaborate etiquette that surrounded wife selling. There were proper ways to conduct a sale, acceptable forms of payment, and specific venues. The practice may have been degrading, but it wasn't chaotic. It followed rules that participants understood and generally respected. The decline of wife selling after 1850 wasn't simply the result of legal pressure or social disapproval. Economic changes were making the practice less necessary and less practical. Factory employment gave women some economic independence, reducing their absolute dependence on male support. The growth of urban areas and the expansion of the railroad network made it easier to escape bad marriages through simple desertion. Changing attitudes toward marriage also played a role. The romantic ideology that was spreading through all levels of society emphasized love and mutual affection as the proper basis for marriage, making the commercial aspects of wife selling seem increasingly repugnant. By the time of the last documented wife sales in the early 20th century, they were widely seen as relics of a barbarous past. The 1913 case in Leeds involved a woman who claimed her husband had sold her to a workmate, but the community response was entirely negative. By then, legal divorce was available to the working classes, and social welfare programs, though limited, offered alternatives to the stark choices that had once made wife selling seem reasonable. The legacy of wife selling extends far beyond its historical time frame. The practice reveals fundamental tensions about gender, property, and personal autonomy that continue to shape contemporary debates about marriage and divorce. It demonstrates how legal systems can fail to address human needs, forcing people to create their own solutions that may be morally troubling but practically necessary. The women who participated in wife sales weren't passive victims. They were active agents trying to improve their circumstances with the limited tools available to them. The fundamental question raised by wife selling remains relevant today. What happens when legal systems fail to provide adequate remedies for intolerable situations? As we close this exploration of one of history's most disturbing customs, we return to that market square where our story began. The woman with the halter around her neck, standing on the platform while strangers bid for the right to own her, represents thousands of women who faced impossible choices in a system designed to deny them agency. Some found happiness in their new arrangements, genuine affection with partners who treated them as human beings rather than property. Others discovered that changing masters didn't change the fundamental nature of their enslavement. All of them paid a price in dignity and self-respect that no amount of practical benefit could fully compensate. Their stories remind us that progress isn't inevitable, and that the rights and protections we take for granted were built on the suffering of people who had no choice but to work within systems that denied their humanity. They remind us that behind every historical practice, no matter how repugnant it seems to modern eyes, are human beings trying to survive, find love, and create meaning in circumstances that offer few good choices. The halters are gone now, and the market squares have been converted into shopping centers. But the questions they raised about human worth, legal justice, and the price of survival remain as urgent today as they were 2 centuries ago. In that urgency lies both a warning and a hope warning that progress can be reversed, and a hope that understanding the past can help us build a more just future.